Those are the unforgettable chimes of the BlackBerry. If you remember those sounds, you are probably like me and thought the BlackBerry would always be part of your workday. I mean, at the time, I couldn't imagine it ever changing. And the people at BlackBerry believed the same thing. They were so convinced they would always have a role in the business world that they became incapable of changing the direction of their company, even as they watched a catastrophic asteroid shaped like an iPhone head straight for their Waterloo headquarters. Now, the reason for BlackBerry's inability to change course wasn't stupidity. Far from it. These were some brilliant people. The reason was fear, and it became the biggest enemy to their success. Hi everyone, I'm Terrace Wayner, and welcome to another episode of a case study in corporate fear, where I do the forensics to better understand how and why fear transforms brave leaders of thriving companies into spineless failures of corporate catastrophes. All so you never do. And while most know the names of failures like Blockbuster, Sony, and Kodak, what most don't know is that the true mastermind behind their collapse was fear. Today's case study analyzes BlackBerry and how their fear of changing what made them successful actually wound up destroying the smartphone pioneer faster than they could text WTF. But before we dissect the collapse, it's important to understand just how dominant BlackBerry was before this malware called fear spread through the company's motherboard. BlackBerry was the brainchild of Mike Lazaridis, a college dropout who started the company Research in Motion, commonly called RIM. In 1999, RIM introduced the very first BlackBerry and changed our world forever. It instantly set the business world on fire with its revolutionary, always-on email connectivity and iconic physical keyboard that made typing with your thumbs not just possible, but addictive. And when not emailing, these newly minted smartphone addicts were busy getting hooked on BlackBerry games like Brick Breakers and Space Lines. The early numbers tell a staggering story of success. Sales in the first year jumped 80% with $85 million in revenue, and it only took 5 years to reach $1 billion in sales. Their profit margins during their golden era were a jaw-dropping 30%, putting them in the same league as Apple during its best years. And the company employed over 17,000 people, with 7,500 in Waterloo, Ontario alone, helping to transform what was once a sleepy Canadian college town into a tech powerhouse that drew talent from around the world. By 2006, the BlackBerry became the must-have product of every member of the C-suite. Their iconic messaging service, called BlackBerry Manager, or BBM, revolutionized how executives communicated. And their military-grade security made them the only device trusted by governments and corporations worldwide. In pop culture, the BlackBerry became synonymous with power and importance. On hit TV shows like 24 and House of Cards, characters wielding BlackBerries and their use were woven into the storytelling. And in The Devil Wears Prada, the BlackBerry cemented the symbol of the always-on workplace culture, with assistants sleeping with devices under their pillows. By 2007, RIM was officially Canada's most valuable company with a market cap of $67 billion. BlackBerry owned a staggering 50% of the US smartphone market, meaning they had a greater market share than the iPhone does today. According to a Gallup survey from that time, the popularity of the device transformed 2/3 of Americans into believing that their work simply couldn't function without their BlackBerry. In fact, during his presidential campaign, Barack Obama famously refused to surrender his BlackBerry after taking office, leading to a special, ultra-secure version being developed for the office of the president. It was the ultimate product placement no marketing budget could buy. From an international perspective, BlackBerry's dominance was even greater. In Indonesia, the company held an astonishing 67% market share. And in the United Arab Emirates, BlackBerry ownership was so ubiquitous among the business elite that when the government threatened to ban the devices over security concerns, it triggered a diplomatic crisis with Canada. Dr. Yasser Obaid, a technology historian at Oxford University, wrote, "What's fascinating about BlackBerry is that it wasn't just dominant, it created entirely new patterns of human behavior." The term crackberry was used to describe the addiction, and it was very real. If you lived through it, you know how it fundamentally changed our expectations of work life boundaries and response times. Every CEO, every government official, every power player in the world had a BlackBerry. People couldn't get enough of Mike Lazaridis' invention. That was until January 2007, when Steve Jobs unveiled the very first iPhone with these infamous 7 words.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
The global mania for the iPhone should have set off blaring alarm bells in BlackBerry's headquarters. But BlackBerry reacted to the new competition with a healthy dose of denial fueled by hubris. Lazaridis set the tone by reportedly dismissing the iPhone during Steve Jobs' presentation, saying, "That's impossible. They must have faked that demo. There's no way you could do all that stuff and have decent battery life." Jim Balsley, BlackBerry's co-CEO, added, "It's okay. We'll be fine." These are words that should be chiseled on the tombstone of every dead tech giant. BlackBerry was suddenly faced with the possibility that everything they believed a mobile device had to look like and how it behaved might be wrong, that their technological advantage might be evaporating before their eyes. But no one within their walls could comprehend just how massive the threat was. Tony Fadell, one of the key architects of the iPhone at Apple, later revealed, "We knew BlackBerry would struggle to respond. They were so deeply committed to their keyboard and their enterprise model that they couldn't see the consumer revolution coming." Steve Jobs was reported to have used this to inspire his iPhone team by telling them, "BlackBerry is going to keep making the perfect 1997 phone while we're building the future." At the core of BlackBerry's denial and their inability to even think about change was the fear of abandoning their identity. You see, BlackBerry had become defined by its physical keyboard and enterprise security, and any ideas or designs that didn't include them were deemed as not being BlackBerry. This led to the company's energy being focused on protecting the keyboard rather than evolving it. So when they were confronted with the iPhone's revolutionary touchscreen interface, BlackBerry executives couldn't even begin to imagine a world where people would type on glass. One executive scoffed, "It doesn't even have a keyboard. How can you do email without a keyboard?" BlackBerry's famous features had become both their greatest asset and their psychological prison. Internal documents later revealed just how deeply BlackBerry underestimated the iPhone threat. A 2007 competitive analysis done by BlackBerry estimated that Apple would sell just 1 million iPhones in its first year, projecting that lack of keyboard, limitations of battery life, and security will severely hamper consumer adoption. But in the first year, Apple sold 6.1 million first-generation iPhones, exceeding BlackBerry's projections by 600%. A former BlackBerry engineer recounted a telling moment in a meeting following the release of iPhone's first-year sales numbers where Mike Lazaridis said, "I don't get this whole iPhone thing. It's a Mac in your pocket, and Macs only have 3% market share. It doesn't make any sense." This was a company whose entire identity was tied to being the best email device on the planet, and it had become impossible to consider that there might be another way to communicate. Then in 2008, stakes were raised when Google entered the battlefield with Android. BlackBerry now faced existential threats from two powerhouses, Apple and Google. But rather than take this as another signal that they should adapt and embrace the growing consumer movement, BlackBerry's leadership responded the way any leadership team with fear pulsing through their nervous system would. They decided to double down on what had worked in the past. You see, BlackBerry executives had become paralyzed by the worry that even the slightest change would drive away their enterprise clients. A senior executive at the time said, "Our business users loved our keyboard. They loved our security features. They loved BBM. If we made changes, they'd abandon us." This led to missed opportunities that could have helped BlackBerry survive. In 2009, BlackBerry had a chance to make their BlackBerry messaging platform available on other growing platforms like iOS and Android. A former product manager revealed, "We had a fully functioning prototype of BBM for iPhone and Android in 2009. And since BBM had 50 million active users, larger than any messaging platform at the time, it was a perfect opportunity to expand BlackBerry's most popular service. Plus, user testing was off the charts positive. But leadership decided to kill the project. They worried it would lead to people buying fewer BlackBerries. They did finally release a version of BBM on multiple platforms 4 years later, but WhatsApp had already taken off and had grown to over 300 million users, making BlackBerry Messenger irrelevant. What BlackBerry couldn't see was that those same enterprise customers were already experimenting with iPhones and Android devices. Mark Wilson, former vice president at General Motors and a dedicated BlackBerry user, admitted, "I loved my BlackBerry, but by 2010 I was carrying both a BlackBerry and an iPhone. I used the BlackBerry for email because of the keyboard and the iPhone for everything else." The walls between consumer and business devices were rapidly crumbling. Carolyn Fitton, a former BlackBerry marketing manager, said, "We had hard data showing that executives were carrying two phones, a BlackBerry for work and an iPhone for everything else. But instead of seeing this as a warning sign, we saw it as validation that our enterprise focus was correct." Instead of acknowledging that the market was shifting toward consumers and touchscreens, BlackBerry rationalized their commitment to the keyboard by saying, "See, even when they buy an iPhone, they can't give up the keyboard. People would rather carry two phones than give up their BlackBerry." Professor Rita McGrath of Columbia Business School, who studied BlackBerry extensively, explained, "What's fascinating about BlackBerry's decline is that they had all the data they needed to make better decisions. This wasn't a failure of information, it was a failure of interpretation." And McGrath wasn't exaggerating about the amount of data BlackBerry had. This podcast would be 12 hours long if I took you through all of it. So, to spare you having to listen to me for half of a day, here are just some of the greatest hits, or should I say misses. First, their market research division had conducted extensive consumer surveys that showed a growing demand for multimedia capabilities and touchscreen interfaces. This was 3 years before the iPhone. And BlackBerry's own engineers had created detailed prototypes and feasibility studies demonstrating that a full touchscreen BlackBerry was not only possible, but would potentially outperform competitors. They also had multiple patents for touchscreen technologies that were left unused in their intellectual property portfolio. Then there were the user behavior studies conducted by BlackBerry themselves, which showed that while enterprise customers valued the keyboard for email, they were spending more time on their other devices for web browsing and media consumption. BlackBerry also had access to carrier data showing that iPhone users were sending 12 times more emails than expected, directly contradicting their data that touchscreens would never be viable for heavy email use. McGrath explained in her Harvard Business School case study, BlackBerry executives were presented with dozens of separate research reports between 2007 and 2010 indicating the shift toward consumer-focused devices in the enterprise space. But when execs got these research reports, one of three things happened. They either dismissed them outright, or reinterpreted them to fit their existing narrative, or they demanded the research be redone with different parameters. As one former BlackBerry market researcher confided, "We stopped bringing certain findings to leadership meetings because we knew they would be rejected regardless of methodology." McGrath calls this the tyranny of success. The tyranny of success occurs when a company's previous achievements become mental handcuffs that prevent it from changing. In BlackBerry's case, when they became indispensable to people's lives, the company became so psychologically committed to this winning formula, they couldn't imagine abandoning what had made them successful, even as they saw the market changing around them. This success bred hierarchies and bureaucracies they felt they needed to follow to maintain their success. But many of these processes that they believed were vital to their survival actually wound up blocking change. Another symptom of the tyranny of success is competency traps, where being very good at something prevents you from becoming great at something new. It also leads to something called loss aversion. Psychological research shows that people feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains. And this led to BlackBerry's fear of losing its identity becoming more intense than the desire to become a leader in new smartphone categories. BlackBerry's identity was so connected to the physical keyboard that moving beyond threatened their sense of who they were as a company. All of this kept BlackBerry focused on what made it successful in the past. And a company trapped in its past will ultimately fear cannibalizing its existing products. And in BlackBerry's case, it prevented them from seizing enormous opportunities. Let's jump back to 2005. Cell phone carrier wars were heating up, and Verizon executives had caught wind that BlackBerry engineers had developed and patented an innovative touchscreen interface. And Verizon loved the idea of being the only provider to offer a consumer-friendly version of the most popular business device in the world. So they approached BlackBerry about creating an exclusive device. By the way, this was 2 years before the iPhone. After debating internally, BlackBerry ended up declining Verizon's offer, fearing it would cannibalize their existing products. Former Verizon executive John Stratton, who was personally involved in the negotiations, said this in a 2018 interview. "We came to BlackBerry with a $100 million development deal to create a fully touchscreen device. But their executives just couldn't get past the idea that it might eat into their keyboard device sales. It was surreal watching a company choose slow death over reinvention." According to internal documents, BlackBerry had at least 5 major innovation projects that were killed between 2005 and 2010 due to cannibalization fears. There was Project BlackPad, a tablet with video conferencing capabilities. Then there was a full touchscreen device with haptic feedback called the Berry Touch, followed by a cross-platform messaging service called BlackBerry Connect. Then a streaming music and video service called BlackBerry Media. And finally, a GPS navigation system with augmented reality called Rim Maps. A Morgan Stanley analyst estimated that the market value of these projects could have captured over $40 billion. An iPhone engineer offered this outside perspective. "All of us at Apple studied BlackBerry closely, and we figured out that their Achilles heel wasn't technology, it was psychology. They were convinced they knew what their customers wanted, even as those same customers were lining up outside our stores." By 2009, the Bring Your Own Device movement was revolutionizing corporate IT policies, and employees were demanding to use their iPhones and Android devices at work. Corporate IT departments were initially resistant, but eventually relented, like parents who swore they'd never let their kids have smartphones. In 2010, facing mounting pressure from customers and carriers, BlackBerry finally attempted to counter the iPhone with their first touchscreen device. They called it the Storm. The PR was brilliant. Everyone from tech publications to daily newspapers were writing about it. And even though it was highly anticipated by just about everyone, it turned out to be a complete disaster. In an effort to please everyone, their engineers developed what they called a clickable touchscreen. That's right, a touchscreen that felt like it physically clicked like a button. And while it may sound like a good idea, the execution was far from it. The interface was awkward to use, and the software was buggy. Complaints were immediate, saying that the device was slow and sluggish and suffered from a laggy performance. Users of the keyboard found that they could type quickly or accurately, but not both. Many buyers posted online that they couldn't remember a device being released with so many bugs. And they were right. In a rush to get the device to market, BlackBerry made the unfortunate decision to ship the Storm with bugs and fix them later, rather than to fix them first and then sell the device. The Wall Street Journal called the Storm a failed experiment at best. But the Storm's failure wasn't just the fault of a poorly designed touchscreen or pushing the release of a product too soon. It was reported that the development was plagued by turf wars between internal groups from the start. The hardware team refused to compromise on device thinness, while the software team couldn't optimize battery life. The security team insisted on encrypting all touchscreen inputs, causing severe lag. A former software developer on the project described it this way: "Working on the Storm was like dropping your cell phone over a cement floor and watching it fall in slow motion, knowing it was going to shatter on impact, but having no way of catching it." One of the main problems with the project was that the Storm team was made up of 17 different project managers from various departments, and each had veto power. And each department was petrified of having their concerns overruled. This created a perfect storm that produced the failed Storm. By 2011, BlackBerry's US market share had plummeted to 16%, down from 50% from just 4 years earlier. Then in October of that same year came what many consider to be a death blow to customer confidence in BlackBerry. A global BlackBerry service outage left millions of users without email for 3 days. This was a devastating hit to a company with a reputation built on reliability. The outage revealed that BlackBerry's most critical security failure was its centralized infrastructure. You see, the company's much vaunted security depended on all data flowing through BlackBerry servers. They had created a single point of security that, during an outage, became a single point of failure. But Apple and Google had built a very different model. Their platform relied on a distributed system, and this proved to be much more reliable despite technically being less secure. Security expert Bruce Schneier explained it this way: BlackBerry built a perfect fortress with one door, while Apple built a city with many doors, but put much better guards at each of the entrances. I remember living through this. Here was a company that got us addicted to continuous connectivity, then it was suddenly shut off. But in that mad scramble to stay connected while going through severe cell phone withdrawal, I figured out how to make it work and get my fix. Like millions of others, I turned to the other device I had been carrying, my iPhone. And like many, I never looked back. To cap off this already really bad year, in December of 2011, BlackBerry was forced to take a $485 million write-down on unsold Playbook tablets. This was their failed attempt to compete with the iPad. And in January of 2012, under mounting pressure from stockholders and the board, as well as an investigation from the SEC, Lazaridis and Balsley stepped down as CEOs. BlackBerry's market value had fallen 95% from its 2008 peak, and the company that once commanded 50% of the smartphone market was left with less than 1%. For BlackBerry's fiercely loyal users, the company's decline was personally painful. Edward Matthews, a financial analyst who used BlackBerry devices for 15 years, explained, "I resisted switching to an iPhone until 2015. I felt like I was abandoning a friend. The keyboard was perfect for my work, but eventually I couldn't keep justifying it when all my clients and colleagues had moved on. It was like being the last person using a fax machine." BlackBerry put itself up for sale, but found no serious buyers for the whole company. Instead, it sold its patents and eventually, in 2016, announced it would stop making phones altogether. What's fascinating is that everything that BlackBerry feared changing actually became a reality. They feared cannibalizing their own products, yet competitors happily did it for them. They feared losing enterprise customers by embracing consumer trends, yet those very enterprise customers embraced consumer devices anyway. What makes BlackBerry's case particularly tragic is that they understood the theory of disruptive innovation perfectly. I mean, these were the same geniuses that disrupted an entire global wireless network, building from scratch a system previously deemed impossible. And yet, these geniuses also convinced themselves that their identity was defined by a tiny keyboard. BlackBerry's identity was so tied up in being seen as a serious business device they began seeing themselves as an anti-consumer device. So it made competing directly with the likes of Apple and Google impossible. This fear of identity loss is perhaps the most dangerous in business because it masquerades as a principled commitment to core values. And BlackBerry thought they were doing everything in their power to protect these values. They saw themselves as brave stewards of a proud legacy. Something I love to do is imagine for a moment a different timeline where a company confronts its fears instead of surrendering to them. For example, what if BlackBerry had embraced the iPhone as a sign of where the market was heading? And what if they had leveraged their strengths in security and productivity while boldly moving toward touchscreens and app ecosystems? In this alternative history, BlackBerry probably would have developed a dual strategy, one where they maintained their keyboard devices for loyal enterprise users while developing compelling touchscreen devices for the growing consumer market. They could have opened BBM to other platforms years earlier than they actually did, potentially becoming the WhatsApp of their day. I mean, they had millions of trusted users that could have helped them pull it off. And their strong carrier relationships and global presence could have positioned them as a genuine third ecosystem alongside iOS and Android, particularly in markets where security and privacy were paramount concerns. BlackBerry could have been the first to truly bridge the divide between consumer and enterprise, the holy grail of the mobile market that even Apple and Google struggled with. Financial analyst Gene Munster of Loop Ventures ran the numbers on the value of this scenario. If BlackBerry had executed a successful dual strategy starting in 2008, embracing both enterprise and consumer markets, Munster's models show they could have maintained a 20% global market share. That would translate to roughly $200 billion in annual revenue today and a market cap north of $1 trillion. BlackBerry teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous fear isn't the fear of failure. It's the fear of changing what made you successful in the first place. That's why it's crucial to always be on the lookout for fearful behavior and learn how to recognize the warning signs in your organization. To understand how fear creates chaos and how it moves and spreads and grows, and to fully understand how good fear is at making even the smartest people in your company do stupid things. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Case Study in Corporate Fear. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more case studies and to better understand the impact fear can have on your company, visit fear-incorporated.com. You will also find the sources and citations used to fact-check this episode.